Mark,
Hello, Stefano.
welcome to Kuznach.
Thank you.
You just arrived, I heard. Thank you for joining Breakfast at Kuznach, a series interviewing Jungians lecturing at the Institute. I would like to start with the usual question I ask. Who was Carl Gustav Jung?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think who Carl Jung was depends on where you met him and where you reside. And in the Copenhagen International, there was a presentation called Who's Jung? And the Europeans were somewhat taken aback by the American presentations on the panel in contrast to the European presentations. And they said that they felt that the Americans had a more personal relationship, that they thought of Jung in a more personal way. I'm not sure about that. For me, Jung was really the person who opened me up to the realm of the numinous. I was largely, I would say, an agnostic prior to discovering Jung. And there was something about the way Jung wrote about the numinous that made it seem so real and crystallized so many of my own experiences, gave it a language that I didn't have before. Now that was when I was still on my clinical psychology internship, really when I began to read Jung, even though I'd had a little exposure to him in graduate school. And he opened my doors to psyche in a way that Freud had never opened the doors. I had taken an undergraduate course in Freud by a well-known Freudian scholar named Bertram McCarran. And there was something very dry about the way it was presented. It didn't feel alive. And somehow, though, in Jung's work, all of the notion of psyche and the interior drama really came alive for me. And then I was able to go back into Freud, back into Melanie Klein, into the object relations theorists, into self-psychology, and have a new appreciation for these other perspectives that they were bringing.
This is interesting. So it seems the question could be instead, who was Carl Gustav Jung? Who is your own Carl Gustav Jung?
Yes, I think it has to be. I think that's entirely in keeping with how Jung saw his own work and his hope for, the famous quote of "Thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian." And I think when we try to become Jungians, we do Jung a disservice, in a sense, in that the idea isn't to be able to speak back all that Jung said and to adhere to it in every letter. It's to internalize the vision that Jung had of the psyche and then make it our own. That's part of the individuation process. And when we simply parrot back what Jung said, we haven't individuated. We've just internalized something, but we haven't individuated it. We haven't made it our own.
Well, Jung used to say, imitatio Christi versus becoming Christ.
Yes, exactly. It's a model of a way of being, not a form to fit ourselves into.
You mentioned the numinous, which is absolutely a very interesting concept coming from Otto. I just wrote a paper. I sent it to you, titled "The Numinous and the Fall of the Berlin Wall," where I link the numinous and development in history. What is the numinous according to Jung?
Well, it's anything that I'm grateful that he doesn't try to define it too closely, because I think it's anything that strikes us as greater than ourselves. Now that can be something geographic like the Grand Canyon or the Alps. That can be numinous. Or it can be a moment as simple as being struck by a leaf falling from a tree. It can be something very small or something very wondrous, and it can be something exterior to us or something interior to us. But it's something that creates a sense of connection to something larger than our individual selves.
We touched briefly who was Carl Gustav Jung. What is his relevance today in 2018?
Well, I think he's certainly becoming more relevant than ever, in the sense that the matters that he speaks of and that he writes about with such eloquence are so pertinent to the issues we confront today. In many ways, we're seeing a resurgence of some of the same issues that Jung was observing prior to World War II, and we're seeing the resurgence of nationalism in the same way that he was observing, and I have the same concerns about it. And then we have the additional concerns of the technological world that seems to be encroaching on the capacity to experience soul in a deep way. And then we have the ongoing specter of climate change that is so vast that it's difficult to fully grasp the significance of it. Although right now we face a little microcosm of it with this impending day zero in Cape Town, South Africa, where an entire major metropolitan city is about to go dry. And we've never faced something quite like that in modern, at any time in the world, the history of the world that we know. So I think all of these things about a sensitivity to our relationship between ourselves and others, between ourselves and psyche, between ourselves and world, those are the things that Jung writes about so beautifully and with such sensitivity that I think his message is now more relevant than ever.
Jung was fond of dreams,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps even more than Freud.
Mm-hmm.
What are dreams?
Well, for me, I think that I have come to the conclusion most simply that dreams are our attempt to digest our experiences in one way or another. And so there's something about experience, either something from the past that's unresolved or something about experience that's moving us forward that we're wrestling with in some way. And so the dream is our way of attempting to digest that experience and to some degree make sense of it so that we can have a relationship with it. I try not to get into many formulas about what a dream is and how to interpret a dream, but to, as much as possible, let the dream speak to me. And I think less and less about what's the meaning of the dream and more about what's the experience of the dream, particularly the experience of the dream ego in the dream. And what does that experience bring to us that has not yet been fully digested?
This week you will teach at the Institute about cultivating the analytic attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Jung was the one that suggested to Freud that analysts should be trained.
Mm-hmm.
And because of this, analysts started to train properly. Gabbard and Ogden wrote about becoming a psychoanalyst.
Mm-hmm.
How does someone become a psychoanalyst? What is your point of view?
Well, their paper is quite beautiful on becoming a psychoanalyst, and they really get at this essence that it's not about learning a set of theories, although that's necessary and essential. And it's not about learning a set of techniques, although that too is necessary and essential. It's about having a particular attitude towards the work. Now, Jung writes about this, but he doesn't give it an overarching label. He talks about the opus, taking the alchemical term for it, the work. And I think he's writing about it there. And he's also writing about it when he writes about the symbolic attitude. But really, when he's speaking about the symbolic attitude, he's speaking about something we hope to cultivate in the patient. And sometimes it's easy to forget that it's something that first has to be cultivated in the analyst. And it's taking nothing for granted. It's always being open to the possibility of surprise. It's always being willing to peek under the rug and see what else something might be other than what it appears to be. So I think it's this holding of a tension between something known and something unknown. And so in teaching, particularly candidates, people who are going to be practicing as analysts, often it's easy to want to latch on to formulas. Things like, well, you always have to confront the shadow first in analysis. Well, the analytic attitude says, in a sense, says there is no first. It's taking whatever's coming into the room, being in the here and the now with psyche as it is, and not having a preconception about what is to be encountered first. And so it's this fundamental basis of trying to open oneself up as much as possible to what's being experienced in the analytic setting.
This is very interesting because psychoanalysis is not so popular today.
Mm-hmm.
There are many other ways to actually get psychological support. Actually, I remember my first analyst, Dr. Albizzacchio, said, one has to be courageous to ask for help and knock at the door of a psychoanalyst, but one has to be much more courageous to stay on the chair or on the couch and let therapy happen, let the cure happen. How do you work with your patients when they come to you and they've never been with a psychoanalyst?
Well, I do give them a somewhat brief introduction verbally during the first session, and these are presented as suggestions rather than rules. I tell them that these are guidelines, so I'll tell them as much as possible, say everything that comes into your mind, feelings, thoughts, images, even if they include me. So in a sense, I encourage them not to censor what's happening. Now, they're still going to do that anyway, but they've at least heard that there is permission to speak openly, both about what's happening in them and what they might be feeling about me. So I introduce the possibility in non-technical language of the transference and the counter-transference right from the beginning. I tell them it's often useful to record your dreams during this process, but there's no demand to bring dreams. I tell them that sometimes it's useful to keep a journal during the therapy process to reflect on things that are experienced during therapy. I tell them that they have the choice of sitting up or lying down on the couch. In a few instances, there would be a few people I would discourage from lying on the couch, and there are a few people I would encourage to lie on the couch, depending on what their issues are.
Can you give an example?
Well, somebody who is already fairly decompensated probably should not start on the couch because it'll encourage further regression, and they probably need a period of time of consolidation of sitting up and monitoring the social cues that go on during a face-to-face session. And if I began to see some stability emerging, particularly in their ego functioning, then at some point later I might encourage them to lie on the couch. In reverse, somebody who's rather tightly wound, seems very rigid, who has difficulty opening up to their imagination, who seems very focused on reading my social cues, whether I'm smiling or frowning or look interested or bored. And for those people, I'll often encourage them to lie on the couch because they're still able to see me if they choose to turn their head, but they don't have to see me. I'm out of their natural line of sight. And so I find that it fosters a greater connection to their imagination, a greater connection to what's happening in their body, a greater capacity to go into a sense of reverie. And when they're able to do that, it facilitates me being able to go into deeper levels as well at the same time.
Mark, is psychoanalysis for everyone?
Well, I don't think it is. I think it's a temperament somewhat, as well as a psychological capacity. And Jung said in one of his writings that psyche is not a democracy, it's an aristocracy, and that many are called to the work, but few are chosen for the work. So I think Jung believed that there was a certain temperament that was more suited to psychoanalysis in general. But that being said, I think that our population has changed over the years as modernity has encroached on our symbolic capacity. As we grow more and more dependent on technology, that's shifted our psyches, and I think we see fewer patients coming prepared to do full analytic work from the beginning. And there's often a much longer period of time needed in order to develop those capacities within the patient. So I try to, unless somebody says something to me that disqualifies them, so if they insist that I do therapy a particular way, and I say I don't do therapy that way, this is the way I do therapy, unless they are insistent on disqualifying themselves, I give everybody an opportunity that comes that wants to try psychoanalysis to see if it becomes possible to work. Because people that I didn't think were very capable end up being capable. Others that I thought were capable end up not being very capable. And so this is part of the analytic attitude of not presuming that I know who's going to benefit the most from psychoanalysis, and give everybody an opportunity that comes and wants it to try.
Especially because many times patients come in with no idea about what psychoanalysis is, or with a fantasy about psychoanalysis from Woody Allen's movies. But there are many ways, and another thing is theory and practice.
I think that I prefer to work with people who don't have an idea about it rather than people who have read something about it and come with preconceptions. You know, when somebody's read some of Jung and has these ideas about anima and animus and shadow and things like this, and they push towards those ideas rather than letting those experiences happen. And so often a little bit of knowledge actually gets in the way of the analytic process. And as much as possible, even if somebody's well educated about analytical psychology or psychoanalysis, I try to keep the technical language out of the analysis. One of my favorite moments in analysis was with a patient who said, you know, I can't really tell what we're doing. It just seems like we come in here and talk, and yet when I leave and I go home, I know something's different. To me, that was the mark of an analysis driven by the patient's psyche, not by theory.
And by the patient consciousness.
Yes, yes.
When patients come and say, that is my shadow, isn't it? That must be my anima or my animus.
Yes.
I find it very destructive and perhaps even counterproductive. I know you're an expert of comparative psychoanalysis. What is that?
Well, comparative psychoanalysis is being able to know enough about a variety of theories to know what the similarities and overlaps are with analytical psychology, as well as knowing what the differences are and where those differences are significant and where they aren't. So I was lucky. In my training, I had a significant influence by a woman who trained at the Society of Analytical Psychology in London named Mel Marshak. And she was a very wide reader. She read, I think of myself as a wide reader, but she was always 5 steps ahead of me. And she was always asking me if I had read the latest this book or that book. And so she would recommend writings of Melanie Klein and other Kleinians, of self-psychology, of object relations, of traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, Wilfred Bion. And so it didn't feel as though there was anything off limits, particularly in my interactions with her. And so I grew to appreciate that theorists have a different orientation to psyche, perhaps even a different language. But it's kind of like this metaphor of the secret garden. There's a number of doors in, and we need to find a door into psyche that is significant to us. We need to find the Jungian door if that's where our predispositions are. But perhaps somebody else isn't going to find their way into the secret garden of psyche through the Jungian door. Perhaps they're going to find it through the Kleinian door. And so there's many doorways in, but we're all navigating the unconscious. And that's the central, most common element of all of these models of psychoanalysis. Now, Jung, in his vastness, alluded to many of these other areas. What we now call intersubjectivity is really what the psychology of the transference is about. He doesn't call it intersubjectivity, but he's describing that domain. And there's so many areas that have come developed in these different schools of psychoanalysis since both Jung and Freud died that articulate more fully things that Jung only had time to allude to. And so I find that these other theories often complement my Jungian training, which I'm very grateful for, but it's not the only voice that I speak with. And even Jung himself in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections said, sometimes you can hear me speaking as an Adlerian, and sometimes you can hear me speaking as a Freudian, and sometimes I'm just speaking as Jung.
I resonate with what you just said. Andrew Selma, who is my PhD supervisor, opened my eyes to this. For example, to relational psychoanalysis, psychosocial studies, and to a variety of authors like Susie Orbach, feminist psychotheory, that I think are relevant. And Susie was actually, or her book, Fat is a Feminist Issue, helped me as a man to work with a male patient who had a problem of weight.
Yeah, his book, The Plural Psyche, was a very formative book for me as well. And he was one of the people that really opened, along with Mel Marshak, opened my eyes that there is a place for this plurality of orientations that doesn't take anything away from Jung at all. It adds to. And so I feel somewhat sorry for people that feel like the only person they're interested in reading is Jung, because that wasn't Jung. Jung, at the Oranos conferences, he was delighted to interact with physicists and anthropologists and mythologists, and he was hungry for knowledge beyond the psychological. And I think that we have to have the same openness. It's that openness to so many diverse fields that Jung carried that I think we've somewhat lost in our valorization of Jung. The Freudians are kind of past Freud. Nobody calls themselves a Freudian anymore. They're over their love affair with the personality of Freud. We're not quite there yet with Jung.
In my recent interview with Professor Luigi Zoya, I asked him, who is Jung? And he started to laugh and said, well, first of all, he's a man, not a god. And the additional point would be to take Jung as a starting point, but not as a catechism. That would be, for me, very important.
Lovely. I agree with that sentiment exactly. Yes.
I would like to ask you a final question. I know you have a new book out this summer by Routledge titled Interpretation in Jungian Analysis.
Yes, Art and Technique is the subtitle of it. Yeah, I'm quite proud of that. I think it's the culmination of my history as a psychologist and as an analyst. And I think it provides something that hasn't been published before, at least in the English literature. Analytical psychology has a somewhat ambivalent relationship with the whole issue of technique, of which interpretation is the most central issue of technique. And Jung, was an introverted person, and he was not comfortable with the systematization of analysis. And yet, through experience, we know that there are certain things that are better done a certain way than others, that not everything goes, that not everything constitutes analysis. And so, it's one thing for Jung, who was a very charismatic personality, to have a great deal of latitude in what he did, but for many people, latitude just creates a certain degree of wild analysis and sloppiness in the analysis. I think there are better ways of doing things, particularly better ways of saying things, and that's what the book is about, is identifying the patterns that are useful to the analytic process, that maximize the expression of the unconscious and do as little as possible to interfere with the expression of the unconscious. And so the book surveys the history of technique and interpretation, both within psychoanalysis and analytical psychology. It gives a contemporary foundation for why interpretation is important in this day and age in which we're paying a lot more attention to relational aspects of analysis, and in particular also the issue of the body in analysis. And there's this perception that somehow language is not connected to relationality and not connected to the body. And yet I review a lot of the literature, both the literature from within psychoanalysis, but also the ancillary literature from neuroscience, from cognitive studies, things like that, that really underpin the notion that what we say and how we say it does matter a great deal, and that there are better ways of saying things. That's one piece of it. And then there's the heart of that to speak interpretively is to speak metaphorically and to speak poetically, to speak with a poet's heart, not in the sense of trying to create or craft beautiful words, not to say things in a pretty way, but the poet takes every word that they construct in a poem and they weigh the significance of that word, and they try to get a sense, a felt sense, not an intellectual sense, but a felt sense of whether that's the appropriate word to capture the essence of a moment. And I think that's the heart of what we have to do as analysts, is to weigh our words with the heart of a poet, to really think quite a lot about what we're saying to our patients, why we're saying it, when we say it to them, the issue of timing. And so the whole book is about this process of the verbal interaction, where we get the words from, not from theories often, although they may be informed by theories, but from learning to work with our own interior experience and to draw from those interior experiences our reactions to the patient, the images, feelings, sensations, bodily experiences that we have while we're sitting with patients, and that those inform what we say, when we say it, things like that.
Do you use clinical cases in your book?
Quite extensively. I was lucky that many of my patients gave permission for me to use verbatim extracts from our sessions. I either record or take extensive notes during many sessions, and so I have long clinical interactions that reflect the different ideas that I'm presenting. And so I have a number of patients that are currently active that are in the book, and as well as patients from long ago that are in the book as well, and was fortunate to receive their permission to utilize the material after they had first read the material.
Can you share with us an example, maybe not revealing, but that will drive us to buy the book?
That's a good question. I didn't come prepared with a thought of a good example that would succinctly capture it. I think that this isn't so much that captures the whole of it. But I have one patient that I do write about in the book who he was speaking about the anxiety that he felt about calling his mother. She had sent him a letter with a check in it. And he had a very difficult relationship with his mother. He was in his 30s at the time. And he had told me the week before about needing to drink 2 beers before he called his mother. And so we're at the close of the session, and I mentioned that he had said in the previous session something about his anxiety, also about his mother, and the needing to drink the 2 beers. And he looked surprised, and he said, "Oh, you remembered." And so if I wanted to conclude that session, I could have just said, "Yes, of course I remembered," and let him go on his way. Instead, I said to him, "You seem surprised that I remembered." And he said, "Yes, I am. I've had other therapists and they didn't seem to remember what I said from week to week." And he got a little bit tearful. And I said, "You seem surprised that I can remember you as an individual from among the other people that come to my office." And he said, "Yes, I am." And then I said to him, "I think it surprises you that you could be important enough to me to hold a place in my mind." And then he became more tearful. And he said, "Yes, I've never experienced that before." So what I helped him do in that series of interventions was not just provide support, which if I had just stopped and said, "Yes, of course I remember you," that would have been a supportive intervention. But what I helped him see in this series of interventions is how he thinks of himself in my mind, which is not an easy thing for people to do. So often they're not aware of it until it's spoken about. So I was orienting from my position of what he was revealing to me about in his reactions to me, that he was surprised I remembered him amongst the other patients. And I had to help him see that he didn't experience himself as memorable. Of course, we're describing a complex there without using any of the technical language, but it gave him an experience of the complex and words for that complex that he wouldn't have had otherwise.
Thank you, Mark. Good luck with the book. I look forward to read it.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the interview, and I enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing your other interviews as they continue.